My name's Michael Mateas. I'm in the computer science department at UC Santa Cruz. My work's in expressive AI, artificial intelligence-based art and entertainment, and I'm going to sort of talk about some work in software studies I've been thinking about now for 7 or 8 years, and end with some of the current kind of theoretical projects this is leading into. So what I've really been, really been thinking about since sort of the, 97, 98, is this notion of building kind of AI systems that integrate authorial and interpretive affordances. And what I mean by that is, what does it mean and how do you think about crafting architectures, platforms, custom programming languages, knowledge representation approaches, such that an artist who wishes to express a particular message to an audience can conveniently and tractably and quickly say just what they need to say to the computer, such that the audience has the experience that the artist wishes them to have. So another way of saying that is that an architecture, and by that I mean the constellation of languages, craft practices that have grown around languages, hardware platforms, et cetera, are really a machine to think with. That the space of what you'll even conceive of saying, kind of the space of the sayable, is strongly constrained and afforded by the architecture. So what does it mean to sort of consciously design that? One way I've tried to get a handle on this idea of architectural affordances is actually to turn to structuralist semiotics. And if you start thinking about, well, what is a code sign? And a code sign is really literally a sign function in a sense of the very unit where the relations of the technical and the significant are woven together. A code sign is something that's understood by the machine and executed. It basically instantiates a causal chain of connections, and it also means something to a human being, and those two things aren't identical. They're related, but they're not identical. So for assignment, a human being might be thinking about, oh, it's sort of like putting a number in a box, or there, some sort of signified to that effect, and then what's going on in the machine is related to that, but not identical. Here's sort of a code sign from a piece called Terminal Time that constructs ideologically biased documentary histories in response to audience feedback by putting this particular rhetorical goal, and this is sort of in a custom language we had to build, into the machine. You're now sort of systematically biasing the space of all possible future documentaries it might generate so as to systematically prefer, under certain situations, specific historical events with specific patterns and put a specific spin on those events. And an architecture really defines these custom sign systems in which you can express. If we think of like, in semiotic terms, the architecture is defining a system, and programs are particular syntams, constellations of code signs expressed in that system. And of course, establishing a sign system is very much a privileged activity. Whoever establishes that sign system is putting very strong constraints on affordances on precisely what's sayable within that sign system by people who express within the system. AI-based artwork is, of course, very generative in that if we now take the system to be the executing this system, actually those code signs under execution, potentiating causal chains of machinic chains of cause and effect, they're going to produce audience signs, and those audience signs support interpretation. So if we look at the relationship between these, we can say that code signifiers, what you're expressing in the architecture, simultaneously signify potential execution and audience signs. And that you can, if you're trying to sort of get a handle on, well, what does it mean to have an architecture or an authorial affordance? It means bringing into alignment, into some kind of alignment, the relationship between possible potential executions and audience signs. However, I'm not claiming that there will be some perfect alignment. In fact, perfect alignment, I would say, is never achievable, and in fact is a bad thing to achieve. I'm going to skip to this. There's a sense, in a very deep sense, in which computation is really always double. There's sort of the code machine, which is where uninterpreted computation is taking place. You have the physical symbol system layer, if you're thinking in those terms, really complex causal flows. And in fact, it's almost impossible to conceptualize the code machine in its kind of raw, uninterpreted state. What we always do when we think about the code machine is actually plug in a whole bunch of rhetorical strategies for narrating to ourselves what the code machine's really doing. And in fact, every language or architecture is simultaneously defining kind of a way of thinking and talking about it, and a sort of chain of, chain of material causation. And the relationship between this code machine and rhetorical machine defines sort of an authorial surplus or architectural surplus. This is the sense in which signs in the system don't literally mean what they mean in the sort of everyday life world. So as an example of that, in a language I've developed for authoring autonomous characters, there's a notion of joint goals, which are kind of a model of teamwork that's built into the language level itself. But of course, human teamwork, and what the sort of human teamwork means, is in no way completely captured by what's meant by a joint goal within this language, able. However, there is a relationship between them, and the slippage between them is what allows you to actually sort of lift via meta-language into connotation, into the human life world, and then sort of circulate back down into the code machine and push new meanings into the code machine. And in fact, it's when you collapse those two meanings that progress stops. And this has been a sort of systematic problem in AI, is that you've had people build systems in which they claim that some particular architecture they've built actually captures learning, like everything there is to say about learning, or everything there is to say about goal pursuit, or everything there is to say about planning. And as soon as you actually collapse those layers together, I would claim that you actually halt any ability to make future progress within that within that set of architectural commitments, precisely because you've killed that sign circulation. That you don't want to collapse those. You want to always recognize that the rhetorical machine and the code machine are non-identical, can never be identical, and in fact, you don't want them to be identical. In some more recent work, we've been looking at, okay, well, if we take this idea, what other code systems might we look at? And in some work with Nick Montford, we've begun looking at the basic program for Hammurabi. And what we're doing here is trying to understand how is it that Hammurabi and the sort of basic culture that existed, the basic hacking culture in the early days of the PC, created a set of craft practices and representational practices that specifically allowed people to talk about code and write code in a certain way. So I guess what I mean by that is there was a historical practice, and there's sort of a historical archaeology you can do at sort of key moments of computing practice, specifically to explore that relationship between the difference in meaning between the human meaning of code and the machine meaning of code. Other work Nick and I have done has been looking at weird languages and obfuscated code. This is a program for computing the factorial in a language called Chef, and Chef is a language that was designed so that every program is something you could potentially cook in the kitchen, and it executes a computation. So this is exactly talking about that doubled meaning, right? That what's nice about some weird languages, particularly a language like Chef and Shakespeare, and there's a number of others, is they specifically play with that relationship between the human meaning of code as a cultural architect, as a textual artifact, and the execution meaning of code to the system. And with that, I'm going to end. Thanks.